Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Zach Ford. I'm a pre-service history teacher at the Western Kentucky University, and today I will be giving you a textbook analysis of American history, the modern era since 1865. We start by looking at some of the credentials of the book, with the author being Donald A. Ritchie. It was published in 2001 by Glencoe McGraw-Hill. It was developed for an American history class in a high school setting. And I will be looking at chapter 19, which is titled World War II, 1933 to 1945. There are four sections. The first one is World Affairs, 1933 to 1939, Moving Closer to War, the United States at War, and War on the Home Front. I will be evaluating three different standards in relation to this text, and I will use the Likert scale to express my agreement as to whether or not these standards were met, and I will also use the element that's a thought to explain the relation of them. The first standard that we come to is SSHS 2.14 that states students understand the democratic principles of justice, equality, responsibility, and freedom and apply them to real life situations. Here we see that I agree that this standard was met within the text, and we'll look at some examples. Here, I went through the chapter and tallied each time one of these themes of justice, equality, responsibility, and freedom were met. And here you can see that it was a very recurring theme. That's why I agree that the standard was met. Some of the examples, one of freedom was a quote from FDR where he stated, "I shall respect the sovereign rights of all nations in the Western Hemisphere." Uh, an example of responsibility within this text was whenever Britain and France pledged to defend Poland from Hitler, and they asked the Soviet Union as well to join in an alliance to contain Germany. And right there, it gives a good example of responsibility because those were the global powers and the strong safe havens that could come to Poland's aid during Hitler's reign. And an example of equality is a quote that was taken from the section 4, where it's talking about war on the home front, and this is whenever it's discussing women working in the industry and factories and stuff. A very popular slogan that they used was, "If you can drive a car, you can run a machine." And an example of justice, we see right after the Yalta Conference, U.S., Britain, the Soviet Union, and France should occupy Germany after the war, but they promised to encourage some form of representative government for the other peoples of Europe. The next standard that we look at is SSHS 2.15. The standard here states that students can accurately describe various forms of government and analyze issues that relate to the rights and responsibilities of citizens in a democracy. Here I give this one a rating of 3 because they do a good job of giving an example of a different form of government, yet they do not give very good examples of issues that relate to the rights and responsibilities of citizens in a democracy. We see this that in the text, the two times that it refers to these is whenever Hitler and Mussolini followed this new doctrine known as fascism, a form of government in which a dictator and supporters cooperate to seek more power for their nation, usually at the expense of rights for individuals. The next point that it makes is each ruler established at a totalitarian state, a nation that totally controls the life of its people. Next, the standard that we look at is SSHS 2.20 that states students understand, analyze, and interpret historical events, conditions, trends, and issues to develop a historical perspective. Here you see that I strongly agree that this standard was met within this text, and we shall see why. Whenever I looked at the standard, it had a list of expectations that they wanted to meet, and where each of these three expectations, I found a perfect example, and I could have made a huge list for this standard as well. That's why I strongly agree. One of the first expectations is that history is a series of connected events shaped by multiple cause and effect relationships, tying past to present. In the text, we see an example of that where Both Hitler and Mussolini hinted that another war might be necessary to right the wrongs they felt had been done to their countries by the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles came after the World War One and was a thing that pushed them to have the Second World War that tied the past to the present. Uh, the next expectation was geography and natural resources have a significant impact on historical perspectives and events. And an example within the text was whenever the USSR was uninvolved in the war until Hitler decided he wanted Russia's vast wheat and oil supplies, which right there we see that natural resources had a drastic impact on the history of them and their war. Next expectation is advances in research. Science and technology have a significant impact on historical events, American society, and the global community. One of the greatest scientific and technology breakthroughs that had a great impact on history was whenever we dropped the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic bomb was secretly developed at the beginning of war and tested in 1945. It successfully brought about the end of the war, but left remarkable damage, taking about 150,000 lives. Some of the assumptions that we see once we look and interpret this data is that the author has a neutral tone in the delivery of information, for it controls how we interpret it. Also, the Kentucky Core Standards have changed since 2001 when this book was published and were probably not even considered when creating the textbook. And also, we assume that this textbook is created for high school students. Some of the conclusions that we see is that equality and change is brought forth out of force. We see that in this text, in this chapter, it clearly shows that the Americans did not really push or want for women to be incorporated into the industry, factories. They did not want blacks into the war, or the Japanese Americans to be involved in the war at all either. But it was forced out of necessity. The next conclusion is that the text provides no reasoning for other governments' existence in order to relate to issues. This goes back to that second standard that we looked at. And the next conclusion is that the text is given from the U.S. perspective without regard to the Eastern reasoning. Whenever it talks about the war and Russia and the Europeans and their involvement within the war, it leaves out a lot of their reasoning, and it could be very much included and helpful for these kids to develop a better perspective. The next conclusion that we see is students are given much information of cause and effect issues and will help them to further understand the complexities of history. Next, the overall purpose of this chapter and text is to give the information given in this particular chapter is to convey the reasons for mass damage, death throughout the world during this time, how boundary lines and alliances were formed and continue to exist, and how World War II was fought and won. Next, we look at three different diversity questions within this text, and we see that there were 77 total recognizable faces when looking at the pictures throughout this chapter, and of those 77, 10 were women. And so right there, that's a very small number of those overall faces that we see, but as we see, whenever they are mentioned, whenever women are shown in the last part, the fourth section, the war on the home front, they are shown in a very well diverse manner. And it shows Rosie the Riveter right there, which says we can do it. And also, whenever it talks of incorporating women into the factories, there's another strong picture that showed women and their strength. Purpose of these images is to show women of today's age how they were an essential part of the success in the overall war, and also to show women in schools can learn how they made the first steps to become equal in law. Next question was whenever I examined the age of these people shown in these pictures, and we see that the two biggest groups were in the 50 and over category, as well as the 20 through 30. And something that we need to understand while looking at this chapter is that it talks of World War II, and a lot of the pictures and images shown are of the soldiers and the people involved with that, which falls under the 20 to 30 age, as well as showing a lot of the leaders of nations, which usually tend to be older males, and so that is what covers the 50 and over category as well. Some of the implications of this data is that students may not understand the contributions the middle-aged community made on the home front. Also, students could view the contributions of older people in society as more important. We also see that from the years 20 to 30 are the most sought-after job occupants. This is what kids could assume from looking at this data. Next part that we look at is race, and I went by the white, black or African American, American Indian or Alaska Native, Asia, or Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islanders is how I categorize this. And whenever we look at it, there was hardly any other images shown other than white males and females, other than the Japanese and Japanese Americans. And of course, whenever we look at the text, that is who we were fighting against, and that's who the other half was based on. One of the assumptions is that photographs and data are skewed from this time period due to the era of history. The implications of this is that students of different race that read and study this text feel that their culture and ancestry is unimportant and irrelevant. Next, we look at the readability level of this text, and I use scoreability.com to figure this out. And whenever I looked at this text, that said it has a readability score of 51.3, and the scores usually range between 0 and 100. And here we see that the reading ease is fairly well. 51.3 is a good number for this text and for these classes. We also see that the average grade level is 10.9, and I got this textbook from a high school setting that was being taught to mainly sophomores at the 10th grade level, with a few, I believe, few or four freshmen and two 11th graders. So 10.9 is a very good average for the readability level here. Next, we see my citations, and I thank you very much for your time.